So in this video, we're going to talk about Rule 8 and Rule 9 in your Rules of Deduction in your book. So Rule 8 is constructive dilemma and Rule 9 is destructive dilemma. So a constructive dilemma has three premises. It's if P then Q, if R then S, P or R, and Q or S. Having three premises makes it look like this is kind of complex, but what we're going to see is that actually the motivation for this pattern of reasoning is stuff that we're already pretty familiar with and comfortable with. So let's look at this again. We have if P then Q, if R then S, P or R, therefore Q or S. So the first motivation that we need to consider is the truth conditions for a disjunction or a disjunctive phrase. That means an or phrase. So we need to look at the truth conditions for a disjunction. Under what conditions is a disjunction true? A disjunction is true as long as at least one of its disjuncts is true. If you said in the truth table rows 1, 2, and 3, that's also fine because those are the rows in the truth table in which at least one disjunct is true. Okay, so we know that since this is one of our premises that P or R is true. And we know that since this is a disjunction phrase, that means that either P or R is true. Now, the next thing that we need to understand about how these three premises can give us this conclusion is an argument pattern that we're already pretty familiar with. Can you guess which argument pattern is going to help us understand or motivate rule number 8? It's modus ponens. So modus ponens, if you'll remember, is a valid pattern of reasoning that gives us the premises if P then Q and P. And it tells us that if we have these premises, if P then Q and P, that we can automatically deduce Q. So if we have this conditional claim and we have the antecedent, then we can automatically deduce the consequent. Okay, so going back to constructive dilemma, we have P or R. And it just so happens that these two disjuncts are the antecedents for the conditional claims in our first premise and our second premise. So we know that the antecedent in our first and second premises might be true. At least one of them is going to be true. So at least P or R will be true. And we know from modus ponens that if the antecedent of a conditional claim is true, then its consequent must also be true. So if at least one of these antecedents is true, then at least one of the consequents must also be true. So if P or R is true, then Q or S must also be true, given these conditional claims and what we know from modus ponens. Okay, so that's how our truth conditions for a disjunction and modus ponens motivates this rule called constructive dilemma. Let's move on to Rule 9, destructive dilemma. So here we have if P then Q, if R then S, not Q or not S, therefore not P or not R. Okay, so our motivation here, we're again going to use the truth conditions for a disjunction. And the truth conditions for a disjunction is that at least one of the disjuncts is true. In Rule 8, we used modus ponens to motivate the constructive dilemma. Which pattern of reasoning do you think we're going to need to motivate destructive dilemma? Here we're going to use modus tollens. And modus tollens, if you'll remember, tells us that if we have the conditional claim if P then Q and we have not Q, then we can automatically deduce not P. So if we have a true conditional claim and the consequent is false, then the antecedent must also be false. Here we see the third premise tells us not Q or not S. Q and S are our consequents. That means that at least one of these consequents must be false. And thanks to modus tollens, we then also know that if one of these consequents has to be false, then one of these antecedents must also be false. So if we have if P then Q and if R then S, and we have either not Q or not S, then that means that it'll be the case either that not P or not R. So if one of these consequences is false, then its antecedent will be false. Here our conclusion is not P or not R. And we know, again, from the truth conditions for a disjunction and from modus tollens, that if we have these three premises, it's necessarily going to be the case that one of our antecedents is false. So it's necessarily going to be the case that not P or not R. Okay, that's it for constructive and destructive dilemma. In our next video, we're going to talk about some more rules having to do with conditional claims.